Hi, I'm Adam Walsh, host and producer of The Signal. There's a conversation that took place in St. John's this week. It was called No Indians Here, an evening with Mi'kmaq elder Calvin White. The discussion looked at the legacy and impact of Confederation on Indigenous folks in Newfoundland and Labrador. Elder White popped by the studio. We had our own conversation about his evening. Here it is. Mi'kmaq elder Calvin White, welcome to The Signal. And Ivan White, Chair, Indigenous Performing Arts N.L. Welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Elder White, your talk, No Indians Here. Why that title?
Well, actually what it is a phrase that we use because of the not necessarily oversight, but because of the either neglect or however you want to term it, of not being raised when Newfoundland joined Confederation in 1949. There were discussions about Aboriginal population, of course, but that only referred to the Labrador area, and that was dropped. And there was no further consideration for those people. But there was never any mention of the Newfoundland Mi'kmaq in the discussions that we could find anywhere in the minutes of the discussions that had taken place. And from the fact that there were no discussions, there was a mindset, I should say, in Newfoundland, and I guess in lots of other parts of Canada who's familiar with Newfoundland, that there were no Indians because there were no mention of us. We weren't included. We weren't part of the Constitution talks.
So then when there's celebrations around the 75th anniversary of Confederation, right, and lots of talk around the province, how does that sit with you, like for your through your lens?
Well, how it sits with me, I'm sad. I'm sad for the simple reason that I can't fully participate with friends and relatives and not necessarily relatives, because most of the relatives will be in the same situation that I'm in, but I can't do the kind of full appreciation and celebration that I would like to do because of the anniversary, for the simple reason that we still face the refusal and the denial and all of the things that took place in 1949. So I feel as if I'm not yet fully a Canadian, or because of what the way it's been dealt with.
Ivan, what about yourself with this?
For me, we're missing education. We're missing there's a huge knowledge gap about when we got here, how we got here, why we came. And I think it's sort of important to begin expressing that through things like No Indians Here at First Light last night.
And tell folks about Indigenous Performing Arts N.L. briefly, if you could.
Sure. The IPA N.L., as we've currently named it, is about discovering, finding, creating, and telling stories from Indigenous people in this province. So that's Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit people. And we're a microphone and an amplifier. That's what we're meant to be.
So then we can start expecting a lot more. Like there's the event that we're talking about, right? The discussion, No Indians Here, and there'll be more stuff to come.
Absolutely. We're going to take Stolen Sisters and Gookum to the powwows, but we start here in St. John's at Government House.
Right. And so, the powwow trail for this summer.
Will be followed. Yeah, we're going to go to Con and then Bay St. George, which is in Platte Bay.
Amazing.
Which you're familiar with.
Yes. Yeah. No, I was out. The Signal was out there last summer, and it was fantastic to be there for powwow. And Elder White, I wanted to ask you, what was it like growing up in Platte Bay?
Oh, the first couple of pages of my book that you were just presented will give you that story, but however, I'll share it with you. It was different to what is now being promoted. Like, my early years and my recollect of growing up in Flat Bay wasn't about feathers and drums and smudging and all of these type of things. These are things that were brought back in the 70s, even in Nova Scotia for that matter, because from 400 years ago, our people had been coerced into becoming Catholics, and we had been followers of the Catholic religion, and therefore this was all considered to be not accepted by even by the Grand Council in years gone by, so it kind of just faded away. And it was only brought back after the stories started coming about the abuse in the schools and the residential schools and the abuse in the communities and the Mount Cashel here and all of these type of things. That's when people who really need something, we all need something to hang on to. That's when people start bringing back the spirituality aspect of our movement that you see now into drumming, into smudging, and all of these different type things. In my early years, in my bringing up, it was just a way of life. I mean, we were people who were constantly in a I refer to it as constantly in an educational and a training environment. You learned from the time you could walk. You learned how to do things that were all geared towards survival. And our education method was never a theory. It was a practical. Everything we learned how to do it, not just about it. Because, it's totally different. I'm sure that you're well aware, and I know there's a lot of people that I've had conversations with who have went to academic training institutes and they concentrated on the theory. They never had a whole lot of experience with regard to the practical aspect of it. And what they did was they found themselves very knowledgeable, but couldn't really do the actual work. So, but in our culture, the as I said earlier, the practical comes before the theory. So growing up, it was practical. We like from the time you're very early age, everything you do is geared towards survival and learning how to concentrate on their survival. Now, a lot of people consider that to be not only an Aboriginal way of life, especially if you grew up in rural Newfoundland, because that's kind of the trend also. But without being too long-winded, what I'd like to offer is that people who came here 200, 300 years ago, when they were left behind because they were only taking up space from an extra cantle of fish that could be put in the boat when it was going home, their survival only happened because they adopted an Aboriginal way of life. They couldn't fish when the winter came and the arbors were filled in and everything else. So they adopted an Aboriginal way of life. That was the survival of rural outport Newfoundland. And that's why I guess that you have so many people who claimed to be just as much as Aboriginal as anybody else when they talk about the registration process and the criteria for the registration process being a way of life. I look at it, and I know that I'm biased, and the biases will show up. But I look at it as it wasn't the Aboriginal people who integrated and assimilated. It was the non-Aboriginal people who assimilated and integrated into an Aboriginal way of life. That was their survival.
That's really interesting. So then, looking now at that history, where we are with, like we've talked about reclamation, we're in an era of reconciliation, and if you look at how you just framed things, what do you think, looking back at that, for where we are now with like some of the progress that's being made, even though there's still a ways to go?
I'm excited about it. This is why at my age I'm 81 and a quarter, so I'm getting up there. And at my age, what I look at is maybe I'm overly optimistic, but I'm looking at the pendulum swinging the other way. I feel that the work that we started in the 70s, and even though it was very challenging, but I feel that at this point in time the pendulum is swinging, and I think that if we continue to do what we're doing here today, and we educate people in Newfoundland and elsewhere, we need to educate them about who we are and what the responsibilities of the federal government is, constitutional responsibilities. I think that there's an opportunity for a buy-in, and I think reconciliation is possible. I don't think for 1 minute, it's never a thought in my mind that the entire population of Newfoundland is racist or discriminatory, or neither is the Canadian public. I feel that there's an ignorance, and that ignorance causes a difference of opinion sometimes because of the lack of education. I describe it as ignorance. The prescription for ignorance is easy to get. It's education, and we all can take that. If there are people out there, and there will be the odd people, this is, we're all human beings, and this is how life is. But if there are people out there that are racist or discriminatory, there's no cure for that, so we don't worry about that. We just bypass those people and work with the people who who are willing to, to open their minds and to listen and be part of. So I think reconciliation has a real chance, but it doesn't have a chance if we don't do what you people have given me the opportunity to do here this weekend. We need more of this. We need to do this. We need to have dialogue. We need to talk. If we don't, then we're going to be out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah. Ivan, want to jump in on any of what you're hearing here?
He's talking about uncovering truth.
Yeah.
So you can't have reconciliation without truth.
Right, exactly.
So we're growing up in Flat Bay for me was not that different. I just don't participate in the same way, the same survival aspects. So I became a administrator and artist instead of a logger, fisher, hunter. I don't do that stuff. But there's lots of different ways to come at this battle or this fight, to take up the arms and go. And I think exposing truth, sitting here and talking about our truth, is the baseline, the fundamental thing that needs to happen in this province.
Elder White, when you talk about the movement, right? So the 70s for the Mi'kmaq movement, what was the beginning of that like when you first started pushing?
Brutal. We were facing total denial from the provincial government, from the federal government, and from the majority of people that we came in contact, whether they were Newfoundlanders or Canadians from the other side of the pond, and even among some of our own people. There was a denial, and some of our own people, the denial came from the fear of being exposed in the areas that they live. Where on the other hand, some of the people, and I'll give you an example, not to deny or to suggest otherwise of the other people, but the people in Conn River and the people in Flat Bay live in an isolated area up until the late Conn River until probably the late 70s, Flat Bay until probably close to 1960. We live in isolated communities. When you live in an isolated community, you don't have the interaction that the other communities have, obviously. So what happened is that even if we wanted to integrate, we weren't allowed to integrate because we were targeted.
Yeah.
Because you're a minority, you're there, you're a little group, and whatever happens or anything that happens becomes the escape of the surrounding population. And the same thing happened in all of Newfoundland. Not only Aboriginal people, it happened in outport communities too. It's like that blame, that shame. I always say that the tools of colonialism was denial and shame. They denied that we were here. Once we stood up and became very vocal about it, then they tried to shame us into going into hiding. So it was very, very brutal. It was difficult. The politicians and bureaucrats. I'm sure that we were the victims of thumbs up and jokes and all of that type of stuff, because they just didn't want. They were probably some of the most ignorant people because they were charged with the responsibility of having to deal with this, of having to confront it, and they. And the only way that we could make any inroads is that we had to be very aggressive about it. It was no good to try to reason, because you couldn't get anybody to sit down to reason with you. You had to become very, very vocal, and you had to become not necessarily obstructive, because we didn't stage any demonstrations whereby we interfered with the public and that type of stuff. But we had to be aggressive in order to get them to listen to us.
Yeah, well, it makes me think as well of the story out of Miapukek of the hunger strikers, right, during the 80s, right? So you look at...
There's an example.
This types of pushing, you look at the hunger strike that went on. I mean, there's a documentary out this year that's available on GEM, The Forgotten Warriors, right? So for folks, if they haven't seen it, I do recommend seeing it. It's quite the documentary. When did you start to think and see you were making progress then through the 70s and 80s as you were doing this pushing?
We started making progress when the government, it was probably in about 1973, there was a small change. What happened prior to that, there was an arrangement between the province of Newfoundland and the federal government for health care in Labrador. They were dealing with the Innu and the Inuit people of Labrador, but there was no mention of Aboriginal people on the island whatsoever. No mention of Mi'kmaq. Back then, that's what they were known as existence. But in 1973, we were successful in bringing Conn River under that federal provincial agreement, and then money started to move. It wasn't going to Conn River. It was coming to the provincial government of Newfoundland, and the provincial government of Newfoundland was administering that money as they were doing in Labrador on a cost share basis. I think it was something like 90-10, but then I'm told that the provincial government would charge 10% administration, so it was 100% paid by the federal government. But the federal government didn't have to assume the Indian Affairs responsibility or the 91-24 constitutional responsibility, because it was not a direct agreement and a recognition of Aboriginal people. It was money flowing to the province on behalf of the province determining who would be the recipients of that money. Once we got Con River to become part of that agreement, I became optimistic that there was a future, there was a possibility, because what had happened. I believe what happens is that, when you take on a challenge and you go so long without making any inroads, you may get tired and you just might give up, you might quit. But if you make one tiny little bit of progress, that sparks not to quit, and that was the spark that inspired me as one anyway, and I'm sure other people not to quit.
Yeah, I can see that, right? You're pushing, that you get the one thing, that first little. It could be a little step in the beginning, but it's so meaningful and impactful.
Yeah.
And
it's not a little step; it's a big step.
Yeah.
Because now what you have is a precedence has been set. The government has set a precedent. They've just accepted one of your communities on the island of Newfoundland, and they agreed to do funding for development in that community. So now a precedent has been set. So now not only do you have the argument of saying, well, what about the rest of us, but you have the potential of having to go to the courts if you need to, because we're supposed to be living in an equal society, and government is supposed to be treating all people equal. So not only do you see an opportunity of a continuation of negotiation, but you see that next step that you try to avoid, but if you need to take it, it's there.
And that did grow, right? There were court challenges, like I think 89, towards the end of the 80s. Tell us, for folks who may not know the history, explain a little bit of what happened in the late 80s.
Well, in 1982, when we negotiated the independent agreement for Con River, which was a 5-year agreement whereby Con would have control of their funding, while negotiating the agreement, I was president of the Federation of Newfoundland Indians, and John Munro, it was a Liberal government in power, and John Munro was the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs. And I got to know John really well. He was very approachable. Whenever possible, he would sit and talk with us. He didn't push us away to his deputies or to other bureaucrats. And he was up front. He wanted to be part of. So during our negotiations, I mentioned to him that I wasn't comfortable. We were close to the signing of the agreement, and I wasn't comfortable because I had no guarantee that we would be able to continue the process with the rest of the Aboriginal population of Newfoundland once we signed the agreement. We would be giving away our power once we signed the agreement. And he was supportive enough that what he did was he gave me a letter of commitment in 1982 that during the life of the Con River Agreement, which was a 5-year agreement that would expire in 1986, that his department would undertake a process to take care of the rest of the Aboriginal communities in the island of Newfoundland for the purposes of coming under to any further agreements or registration, whatever the end goal would be. And and he gave me that letter, and that letter was very important and was very powerful because it was a letter from the Crown committing that we were moved. So now we had another, we were super excited now because we had a commitment. We thought we were going to move. Now, I don't know how long you want me to go on, but I can tell you what happened was there was a federal election, and the government changed. And Munro was no longer there. He was gone because we had a conservative government that took power. However, I must say the bureaucrats had their direction. Bureaucrats don't change. It's the
exactly. Yeah.
Change. And they had their direction from Munro, and they continued to work with me. And we were at a very crucial stage of signing an agreement. In fact, they notified me that they were willing to come to an annual assembly in Newfoundland, an annual assembly of the Federation of Newfoundland Indians, and they were coming to make the announcement and to sign an agreement in principle. In fact, they had went as far as providing me with not me personally, but the Federation of Newfoundland Indians, providing us with research money to have an anthropologist student who I hired from Alberta, was doing anthropology studies here in Newfoundland. Dorothy Anger was the lady's name. And I hired her to do the files of the Aboriginal population that we had not all concluded. What happened was is that I have no concrete evidence, but I'm told that during a cabinet meeting, or shortly after a cabinet meeting, when they were coming out of the meeting, the minister at the time might have been Axworthy. I'm not positive of that, but it's the name that I seem to recall. And he said to the most powerful minister from Newfoundland, we are going to resolve the Newfoundland Aboriginal issues, and I have some people going down to the Federation's annual assembly, and we're going to sign the agreement in principle, and we're going to proceed with it. And I'm told that this minister looked at him and said, it'll be over my dead body. It's not going to happen. Whether that really happened, whether it's true or not, but that was the inside information. I had made some very good connections in Ottawa, and I tend to believe that it was true because the two people that were designated to come to Newfoundland canceled their reservations the next day.
Right.
And they didn't. And that was it. And from there, it was a total refusal with regard to the commitment that had been made by the previous government.
But then we get to 89, there's legal action brought by F&I against the federal government, and things move forward, and eventually we get the establishment of the Halbu Mi'kmaq First Nation bands.
Well, yes, the 89 thing, what happened was is that I tried everything that I possibly could do other than a sit-in in Ottawa, which mightn't have got me nowhere other than in jail. And I found that I was at a losing end of the bargain. So what I decided to do was I had to let the clock run out, because the agreement was to from 1982 to 1986. I needed that date to expire, or at least I felt I did. And once that expired, then I needed to prepare a process and look for a law firm to engage in legal action. I made contact with the Honourable Ed Roberts, who was an ideal person for the work. He was not only was he from a very reputable law firm, very well experienced, but he was also a politician, which was I felt that was very important, given the fact that the commitment that I had was from the same party that he was part of, that being the Liberal stripe and in Newfoundland, but they're all connected. And I approached him and asked him if he would take on that response, and he did. He took it on. And it was a while before the file moved, because I thought that the best thing that I could possibly do then would be to resign. Like I had burnt all the bridges in Ottawa. I didn't have any friends up there anymore, and I didn't have a big lot of friends in Newfoundland in the government. Mr. Peckford wasn't very fond of me either, because he was one of the people who didn't want Indians, and he made that well known to us. So I decided that the best thing that I could do would be to move on. Also, I had a young family, and my salary was $14,000 a year, and I had 6 children and a wife who had give up her job, so because we wanted our kids to be raised with our values, not with the values of a babysitter. So I found myself having to look elsewhere, but still connected and still attached to the movement. As you can see, I'm still here.
You're still doing stuff, yeah.
But yeah, we started a court process.
Yeah, and I wanted to dip briefly into that, because in all of this, I wanted to paint the picture for folks just about when we talk about activism, when we talk about pushing and struggles and movements, just to get an idea of the different types of ways, the levers being pulled, the avenues being exhausted to further the cause, right? So Ivan, yourself, having grown up around watching and hearing about this, what do you think about just all of that effort, and to see the results that came from the steps that were gained?
The results. I would like to have seen more on our part. Yeah. For results. Yeah. Results wise, because I think what we're looking at now is a further an extra layer that we have to push into or push through of bureaucracy.
Right.
That exists between us and what we have as entitlements. If I'm using that word incorrectly, you can let me know, Elder White. The entitlements that we have as Indigenous peoples, as Mi'kmaq peoples on this land. And it's what I find is missing personally isn't land, or it's ours, because I'm a storyteller. Yeah. All the arts that I practice are based in storytelling. They're mediums that allow story, song, film, and writing. They're mediums that carry stories. And I think that what we're missing is the layers of our story that go alongside the story of this province.
Yeah.
The way this province was, he alluded to it. You wouldn't be able to survive on this land if we wouldn't have taught you, because we came from a place that was very similar in geography, weather, and the way it worked. And then we come here, and for at least 100 or so years, the ships didn't come ashore, except to put a flake on a beach. But when people started settling, the actual settlers of Newfoundland, the people who began to come here 100 years after Cabot, they had to be taught how to live here. And so I think I may have written this down somewhere that's been published, but I can't differentiate Newfoundland culture in the sense that it's survival with Mi'kmaq culture in the sense that it's survival, because they become one and the same. We taught you how to survive on this land, and it's become a part of Newfoundland culture. But why don't we talk about that? Why can't that layer be added to the whole story?
So it's like there's a decolonizing, or there's an unlearning, and then a relearning or new learning of what actually happened, right? Like you said, of marrying the stories together,
right,
to be a true representation of what happened.
Right. So we accept a bunch of things as Newfoundland culture, but we don't accept the history that brought them to be Newfoundland culture.
So how does that get done?
By what we're doing here today.
Yeah.
It's going to take some time. But it requires the big piece that was missing in all of those years, is still missing it today. Excuse me, is the teachings in the classroom.
Yeah.
There was never any history about our people in the classroom. From kindergarten to university, there was never any information on. We were denied.
Correct information.
We were away.
Yeah. And what was there was
What was there was incorrect.
Well, there was one, but it was so derogatory and so false that it was shaming. There was one line, and I think it was either grade 4 or grade 5 geography. I'm not sure which one.
Social studies.
And all they said was that the Mi'kmaq were brought here to kill the Biotic, period. That was the end of it. There was nothing else.
Yeah.
Well, we in the early 70s, when we organized, one of the very first things we took on was to challenge academics and historians alike to find evidence to substantiate that myth. And that's what it was, a myth, we believe, and still today. There's nobody to this point in time that has been able to produce evidence to show that actually happened, that took place.
The accuser's sort of on the hot seat to provide evidence of genocide, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
None has been.
None. Right. The word shame has come up a few times. How hard is it for folks to move beyond that?
Very difficult. Very, very, very difficult. Not difficult for me.
Yeah.
Because I lived in a community, and most of the people in my community, not everybody. I'd be lying if I said everybody is the same. But most of the people in our community, in our area, in the extension of the entire community, like Flat Bay, St. Teresa's, all of that area, Journals Brook, they lived with discrimination and shame. They were because we were targeted by the surrounding communities. I've uncovered evidence that if I was to read it for you, you'd be shocked to believe. Just one of the examples is when the American Air Force Base started up in Stephenville. The Americans brought with them to the Bay St. George area an outbreak of venereal disease. It was widespread in the Bay St. George area and brought by the Americans. That was recorded. The Department of Health for the government at the time, which we were not part of Confederation, it was before 1949, they did a study, in the Bay St. George area. They talked about the cases. They talked about how many people they had tested as far as like in the records to the St. George's area. Then they wrote a little section in that the community west of St. George's, which was populated by the Jacquetars, the French Indians, not to go there at all, because that community would have been totally polluted because the women were so permissive. That's the word. And the men were away most of the time in the woods.
Yeah.
So that was the kind of things that would happen. That's the only time our people would get mentioned was in a negative way of speaking. There was a songwriter, a local guy from the Codrai Valley, a gentleman by the name of Paul Hall, and he used to make up songs, and that he was just more of a comedian than anything else. And he made up a song on the Jacquetars, the French Indians people, and it was very, very derogatory. That song made it to the social studies, folklore and their makers in Memorial University. So every student that was coming to Memorial University and was doing folklore could go pick up that book and read it, and read about the Jacquetars, the despicable people that lived in the Journals, Flat Bay, Shallop Cove area.
Yeah, so that's what makes it to university, not like the history that you're talking about that got omitted.
Exactly. And so those are the kind of things that some of our people were forced to be able to shy from, to hide. And in order to hide from that, you had to hide yourself, because you didn't want your children exposed to be, oh yeah, there's one of those people they're talking about. You didn't want to be targeted, so you did everything you possibly could do to hide from your target. But as I said earlier in the beginning of our conversation, when you look at people that live in isolated communities and haven't been removed from as close as you possibly can go to an Aboriginal traditional way of life, living off the land and all of these types of things, those people are not going to escape that identity. They're not. They just can't get away from it.
Talking about children, Father's Day is this weekend. You're a great-grandfather now?
Yep.
So, father, grandfather, great-grandfather, father. You're not a great-grandfather, or you're not a grandfather yet.
Just a father.
But
better not be a grandfather.
when we look at Father's Day, and you look at the generations, so Elder White, you look at the generations of your family. Ivan, you look at yours, and you think of the future and being dads, and so on and so forth. What are your thoughts around that?
I'm in my particular case, I'm excited. Most of my great-grandchildren are away because my grandchildren had to go away in order to make a living. And Albert being the attracted area, I have two granddaughters who are living just outside of Edmonton. Both of them are in the medical field, and one of my granddaughters has two kids, and one of them is a little boy. He's like 8-year-old. Just last week, he come home from school, and he told his mom, he said, "You got to buy me some hoops," because he said today, we had a demonstration in school of a hoop dancer, and that's what I want to do when I grow up. So I'm excited. I'm excited to see my great-grandchildren embracing.
It's quite the thing, right? Like, to talk about that journey and using word shame, and then a grandkid comes home, it's like, hey, hoop dancing, right? Ivan?
Yeah, it's the tools. It's the tools that he's given us that we can take. And my job as a father is to protect my kids.
Yeah.
And it's not just to protect my kids from danger, it's to protect my kids from the things that I experience that you would consider microaggressions and racism.
Yeah.
And the best way to do that is, instead of arguing with people on Facebook, is to dispel the rumors and to tell the truth. And to go to the records room at Memorial and use their online services and find videos of that man. After I interviewed him for my job at Memorial is Indigenous Education Specialist, and I'm doing a project called Speaking for Ourselves. And I interviewed Uncle Calvin, and what he said sounded familiar. So I went to the Memorial University archives and I looked up videos of him in the late 70s and the mid 80s talking to people in gigantic rooms, and he was saying the same thing. So our job now is to make sure that he doesn't have to keep saying the same thing. So that we can get over that and move on to the next thing, to layer in the story and have it be told. So my kids don't have to be called the Indians from Flat Bay when they leave the community that they currently live in. They can be considered people.
Yeah. And you have the stories of culture, the stories of history that are intertwined with everything else that's happened on the land, and you have folks being welcomed to powwow in the summer, and it's a celebration like it should be, because, I mean, I was there just last year, and I find growing up, the fact that it took me until I was in my 40s to go to a powwow is something that, like, I would have liked to have seen.
And how did it feel? Did you feel welcome in the community?
100%.
Right?
Right.
Yeah.
Both times, right? Flat Bay and down in Meowpukek. Guys, I'm really curious about, so we're in this time where you've got reclamation of history and culture going on, but then in the news, there's also, you have folks who will come out and you hear stories about, quote unquote, like Pretendians. Like, how can communities balance the reclamation side of things now with some of then there's some lateral violence that will go on, and then there's folks who are making claims that are just not true and gaining a system for their own advantage and taking advantage of opportunity.
Yeah, that's happening worldwide. There's no question. There's no doubt about that. That's I don't know if it's a culture of colonialism or you know, I don't think it's probably just related to colonialism. But anyway, it's happening. It's widespread. The onus is on ourselves. Like, we have to empower our people. We have to empower people to make sometimes what is not going to be considered as popular decisions. You know, we need to get away from the point system that the government put in place when they decided that they were going to do a registration in Newfoundland, whereby you had to have so many examples of berry picking and so many examples of fishing and so many examples of how many times you visit your home and how many powwows did you go to. That's not the definition of an Indian. What we need to do is we need to look at what is true citizenship, and we need to define that. I'm not about to do it on my own, but I know that it has to be done. We need to be able to define that citizenship and apply that as citizenship in its entirety and make it, that's who we are. And that's who's going to be a member, that's who's going to be part of our respective councils. But as long as we allow it to filter out there and get as large as it is now, we're going to have those problems.
Yeah, because there's obviously some irony there, right? Like a point system from a colonial structure talking about indigeneity.
Yeah.
Right. And the motivations behind I think from my perspective as a Mi'kmaq man, when I see people who have been promoting themselves, and they enter into certain spaces, and you can hear that they're not introducing themselves correctly. They're not talking about their family and their community and where they grew up and how they grew up, which is a natural part of how I introduce myself. For example, I did that when I started working at a organization on the other side of this island. And I was talking to a man who had a Portuguese accent, and I asked him, "So where are you from?" And 3 people jumped to his defense to say that I couldn't ask him that question. And he said, "Whoa, hold on. All 3 of you need to sit down." He just did that with me. He told me about his family, where he's from, how he grew up, why he's here sitting before me. And I want to answer his question. That's a perfectly relevant question for us to ask. Who are you and where do you come from? Who do you come from? Who are you connected to? And those are the questions that you'll find are, we'll call them red flags for people who introduce themselves. They do it incorrectly.
They do it incorrectly. They don't carry a history with them. It's just not there, right?
Right. They're disconnected from it because it doesn't exist.
If I may, when I took on the responsibility of organizing the communities, like I didn't do a paper trail or I didn't ask for volunteers. What I did was I used oral tradition. Like I grew up in a community whereby I knew the people who were connected to Flat Bay because every summer they visited. They came with their tents, they put them up in the field. They were there for berry picking. They were visiting their families. There probably wasn't enough room for them to stay in the house. All the kids would stay outside in the tents, and then the adults would stay in the house. So we had a connection to people, like the Webbs from Corner Brook. You might as well say they grew up in Flat Bay. The Martins from Corner Brook, they grew up in Flat Bay. Whenever school was closed, they were there. there was a family, just lost his name now again, but from Grand Falls was the same thing. Their grandfather was in Flat Bay. So whenever they were out of school in the summer, they were in Flat Bay. Gormans it was. And this was common knowledge growing up who the people were. So when I left home, as an example, when I left home to Oregon, when I took on the responsibility of organizing the bands, and I went to Benoit's Cove, I didn't go there knocking on doors asking people who they were or where they come from. I went there looking for Wilson Sams, because Wilson Sams had been born and raised in Flat Bay, and I knew that William Sams was an Indian because he was always called an Indian. His grandmother was the last fluent-speaking Mi'kmaq person in our community, so I knew exactly where I was going and who I was looking for. And when I went to Wilson Sams's home, I didn't have to introduce myself because he knew I was. He didn't know me as well as he knew my dad, but when I went to his house, he said, "I remember you, you're Gus White's son." So this is how we done. And then I would sit down with Wilson, and we would have a conversation, and Wilson would introduce me to other people in the community that he knew and recognized as being Aboriginal people. And we did that throughout the entire area. You know, in Corner Brook again, we had the Webbs and we had the Mitchells, and all of those people were identified in historical documents. You know, so there was no trouble to find a key person in each of the families and then find out who the offsprings were.
Yep. So for the most part, right, community knows community. Yep. And people, you will know folks from talking how they introduce themselves and knowing their history. But is there ever for reclamation or reconciliation? Is there, when we talk about like some lateral violence that can happen? Is there any risk that it can damage the process sometimes when you have some folks claiming indigeneity compared to others, and if perhaps they don't know their history but yet they're trying to observe and they feel part of it? Like, is there any danger that can happen here for the process?
I found opportunities where I've dealt with that over the last couple of years, over the last 3 years in particular, and what I found is that the Aboriginal people themselves, the people that have been known and always identified and have the documentation to substantiate their families, they don't get involved in the battles or controversy with it, but they laugh it off. Yeah. You know, they won't say it publicly. Like if you went to a powwow somewhere and somebody showed up, you know, and they're loaded down with feathers and all of the different things that's beautiful, that they want to come and they want to dance or something. And if you're close to one of those people and they know who you are and you know who they are, they'll say to you, "Well, look at that there now. He really thinks that he's an Indian, you know." But that's as far as they go. There's no confrontation. They won't make any acquisitions. They won't do anything like that at all. But they let you know that they're not satisfied with it and they're questioning it.
And they come at it with empathy and compassion, which is the correct thing to do, because they're looking at another person. This person is just maybe lost or confused, but what he's talking about, there's a program in Nova Scotia called Wula Naginu. We know who we are. Yeah. And that's what he's talking about. We know who we are, and we know our own people.
Elder White, I was looking up some of like your bio today before the conversation, right? And it's, it's on the list. The commemorative medal for the 125th anniversary of Confederation of Canada, the Order of Newfoundland and Labrador in 2015. With the work that you've been doing, if you were to tell yourself, the young you growing up, as you started in this, like in the 70s for that push, what you'd be getting later on in life for awards and acknowledgments, would that shock younger Calvin White in the 1970s to be like, yeah, no, actually, at some point you're going to get a commemorative medal for 125 of the anniversary of Confederation of Canada and also the Order of Newfoundland and Labrador in 2015?
Yeah. I would have laughed it off like the person I just mentioned to you who laughs off somebody who's pretending to be an Indian, because that was not reachable. However, having said that, it's a good time to mention that tonight when I go to do my presentation, I will wear those medals.
Right.
With honor, for one particular reason. Like, I think it's important that people in society see what the colonial institutes that I've been fighting with and against have recognized. those medals, they weren't, it wasn't like you didn't buy a ticket onto them and receive them, or it wasn't like they said, well, we're going to pick the next fourth person that comes in the house. It was done by a selection of people who have a very high recognition by the institutes that they serve. And when I was given the honor of receiving those medals, I had two thoughts. The first one was, should I take them? Maybe I shouldn't take them, because we haven't fulfilled the obligation to Aboriginal people. But then my second thought, after giving it consideration, yes, I'm going to take them, because here's a group of non-Aboriginal people who are part of the institute that I'm fighting with, that I'm arguing with, who's recognizing me for my truth and my contribution. So it's now, to me, it's become a symbol of, this is not only an Aboriginal population's concern. Society has recognized that there's been an injustice and there has been a warrior taking on these challenges.
What did you think about that answer, huh?
I could tell you that is exactly what he would have said to himself in the 1970s. He would have told himself to take those medals. And that's the strategy that we've been using the entire time to not verify, but to highlight the community of Flat Bay. So we did traditional land use and occupancy studies, and we talked to people. And then we would go find their family stories represented by one sentence in an old colonial record. To say, oh, my family was down in Muddy Hole, which is Flat Bay Flat Bay East for people who don't know. Muddy Hole is the mouth of Flat Bay River. Yep. And there's family stories that say, well, we used to take eels out of there by the mountain. And then come to find I don't remember whose record it was, but there's a ship anchored out in St. George's Harbor, and they talk about the quantity of eels that are being taken at the mouth of a river just southwest of them. And that's Flat Bay River.
As we've talked a bit about like the look ahead and stuff, right? And just what needs to still happen. So as we wind down this conversation, any other thoughts on what progress needs to happen, or if there's still pushback that is happening now that needs to be pushed through?
There's pushback, but as I said earlier, I feel confident that the pendulum is swinging, but the thing about it is that we can't let up. We have to increase the dialogue, and we have to concentrate on our young people. We have to empower young people. We have to get them to get over the denial because of shame.
Yeah,
there should be no more denial. We have lots of young people who are part of the educational system now because of the programs that was brought about by Hollywood, which helps them for the first time to be able to partake in university and other types of training and that. But what we need to do is we need to make sure that they embrace their identity and we empower them to be able to defend themselves. Because if not, what we're going to do is we're going to lose a very valuable resource. The most valuable resource that any society can have, it's its people. And I mean, that's obvious because of the work that Ivan has been doing. But we need more Ivans. We need, and it doesn't mean that everybody has to take on an Aboriginal cost that is going to school. We still need doctors, and we need our lawyers, and we need our teachers, and we need but we need all of those people. But we need them to embrace who they are. And by embracing who they are and becoming educated about their history, because a lot of them has not been exposed to their history through no fault of their own, then they can become educators in the lunchroom and in the workplace and everywhere else. And like I said earlier when we began, I don't think that we live in a total racist society. I think we live in an ignorant society. And once that ignorance has been cured, I think that reconciliation can become a reality. But reconciliation will never be a reality if we allow it to remain a buzzword. If it's something that sounds important to every institute that is out there, because they can pride themselves in saying, well, we embrace reconciliation. Well, embracing reconciliation in words is not enough. What we need is in actions. If you embrace reconciliation, let's see what you're going to do about it. And one of the things that they can do about it is they can pressure their politicians to put this on the priority list. That's been one of the problems. You know, without taking up the rest of your show, I want to point out that we are not a provincial responsibility.
Yeah.
The Constitution of Canada defines very clearly that the federal government has the total responsibility for Aboriginal people. But that doesn't mean that we don't live in a province and we can't be provincial partners. And it doesn't mean that the provincial government has no responsibility for all of the residents itself. So when you talk about the seal fishery being a priority, when you talk about the cod fishery being a priority, when you talk of all of those things that has been termed as injustices in some cases by the federal government of taking advantage of Newfoundland as an island and as a people, then we would like them to see put Aboriginal issues on that agenda too. Because when they're talking to their counterparts and when they're talking to their prime minister, they need to be able to say, and oh yes, we have one other issue. There's been an injustice in Newfoundland. It was created in 1949 when you penciled the Aboriginal people out of Confederation. And in the latest attempt that you have made to try to include them, it's only been an attempt, it's not full inclusion, and we have unfinished business in Newfoundland, and you need to address that. So that's how we need to be able to change this dialogue.
Ivan, any final thought from you?
I can't beat that.
I didn't think you would. Guys, thanks so much for this conversation today. I really appreciate it. Good luck with everything this evening.
Thank you for having us.